Chapter 2, Part 2. For a while I thought the Loop could be a street in Circle Village, a neighborhood that was nothing but looping cul-de-sacs, and that Emerson might be a person my grandfather had sent letters to, an old war buddy he'd kept in touch with or something. Maybe this Emerson lived in Circle Village, in one of its loops, by a graveyard, and one of the letters he'd kept was dated September 3rd, 1940, and that was the one I needed to read. I knew it sounded crazy, but crazier things have turned out to be true. So after hitting dead ends online, I went to the Circle Village Community Center, where the old folks gathered to play shuffleboard and discuss their most recent surgeries, to ask where the graveyard was and whether anyone knew a Mr. Emerson. They looked at me like I had a second head growing out of my neck, baffled that a teenage person was speaking to them. There was no graveyard in Circle Village, and no one in the neighborhood named Emerson, and no street called Loop Drive, or Loop Avenue, or Loop anything. It was a complete bust. Still, Dr. Golan wouldn't let me quit. He suggested I look into Ralph Waldo Emerson, a supposedly famous old poet. Emerson wrote his fair share of letters, he said. Maybe that's what your grandfather was referring to. It seemed like a shot in the dark, but just to let Golan off my back, one afternoon I had my dad drop me off at the library so I could check it out. I quickly discovered that Ralph Waldo Emerson had indeed written lots of letters that had been published. For about 3 minutes I got really excited, like I was close to a breakthrough, and then 2 things became apparent. First, that Ralph Waldo Emerson had lived and died in the 1800s, and therefore could not have written any letters dated September 3rd, 1940. And second, that his writing was so dense and arcane that it couldn't possibly have held the slightest interest from my grandfather, who wasn't exactly an avid reader. I discovered Emerson's soporific qualities the hard way, by falling asleep with my face in the book, drooling all over an essay called Self-Reliance, and having the vending machine dream for the 6th time that week. I woke up screaming, and I was unceremoniously ejected from the library, cursing Dr. Golan and his stupid theories all the while. The last straw came a few days later, when my family decided it was time to sell Grandpa Portman's house. Before prospective buyers could be allowed inside, though, the place had to be cleaned out. On the advice of Dr. Golan, who thought it would be good for me to confront the scene of my trauma, I was enlisted to help my dad and Aunt Susie sort through the detritus. For a while after we got to the house, my dad kept taking me aside to make sure I was okay. Surprisingly, I seemed to be, despite the scraps of police tape clinging to the shrubs and the torn screen of the lanai flapping in the breeze. These things, like the rented dumpster that stood on the curb, waiting to swallow what remained of my grandfather's life, made me sad, not scared. Once it became clear I wasn't about to suffer a mouth-frothing freak-out, we got down to business. Armed with garbage bags, we proceeded grimly through the house, emptying shelves and cabinets and crawl spaces, discovering geometries of dust beneath objects unmoved for years. We built pyramids of things that could be saved or salvaged, and pyramids of things destined for the dumpster. My aunt and father were not sentimental people, and the dumpster pile was always the largest. I lobbied to keep certain things, like the 8-foot stack of water-damaged National Geographic magazines teetering in a corner of the garage. How many afternoons had I spent poring over them, imaging myself among the mudmen of New Guinea, or discovering a cliff-top castle in the kingdom of Bhutan. But I was always overruled. Neither was I allowed to keep my grandfather's collection of vintage bowling shirts. "They're embarrassing," my father claimed. His big band and swing 78s. "Someone will pay good money for those." Or the contents of his massive, still-locked weapons cabinet. "You're kidding, right? I hope you're kidding." I told my dad he was being heartless. My aunt fled the scene, leaving us alone in the study, where we had been sorting through a mountain of old financial records. "I'm just being practical. This is what happens when people die, Jacob." "Yeah? How about when you die? Should I burn all your old manuscripts?" He flushed. I shouldn't have said it. Mentioning his half-finished book projects was definitely below the belt. Instead of yelling at me, though, he was quiet. "I brought you along today because I thought you were mature enough to handle it. I guess I was wrong." "You are wrong. You think getting rid of all Grandpa's stuff will make me forget him? But it won't." He threw up his hands. "You know what? I'm sick of fighting about it. Keep whatever you want." He tossed a sheaf of yellowed papers at my feet. "Here's an itemized schedule of deductions from the year Kennedy was assassinated. Go have it framed." I kicked away the papers and walked out, slamming the door behind me, and then waited in the living room for him to come out and apologize. When I heard the shredder roar to life, I knew he wasn't going to, so I stomped across the house and locked myself in the bedroom. It smelled of stale air and old shoe leather and my grandfather's slightly sour cologne. I leaned against the wall, my eyes following a trail worn into the carpet between the door and the bed, where a rectangle of muted sun caught the edge of a box that poked out from beneath the bedspread. I went over and knelt down and pulled it out. It was an old cigar box, enveloped in dust, as if he'd left it there just for me to find. Inside were the photos I knew so well: the invisible boy, the levitating girl, the boulder lifter, the man with a face painted on the back of his head. They were brittle and peeling, smaller than I remembered, too. And looking at them now, as almost an adult, it struck me how blatant the fakery was. A little burning and dodging was probably all it took to make the invisible boy's head disappear. The giant rock being hoisted by that suspiciously scrawny kid could have easily been made out of plaster or foam, but these observations were too subtle for a 6-year-old, especially one who wanted to believe. Beneath those photos were 5 more that Grandpa Portman had never shown me. I wondered why until I looked a little closer. They were so obviously manipulated that even a kid would have seen through them. One was a laughable double exposure of a girl trapped in a bottle, another showing a levitating child, suspended by something hidden in the dark doorway behind her. The third was a dog with a boy's face plastered crudely onto it. As if these weren't bizarre enough, the last 2 were like something out of David Lynch's nightmares. One was an unhappy young contortionist doing a frightening backbend. In the other, a pair of freakish twins were dressed in the weirdest costumes I'd ever seen. Even my grandfather, who'd filled my head with stories of tentacle-tongued monsters, had realized images like these would give any kid bad dreams. Kneeling there on my grandfather's dusty floor with those photos in my hands, I remembered how betrayed I'd felt the day I realized his stories weren't true. Now the truth seemed obvious. His last words had been just another sleight of hand, and his last act was to infect me with nightmares and paranoid delusions that would take years of therapy and metabolism-wrecking medications to root out. I closed the box and brought it into the living room, where my dad and Aunt Susie were emptying a drawer full of coupons, clipped but never used, into a 10-gallon trash bag. I offered up the box. They didn't ask what was inside. "So that's it?" Dr. Golan said. "His death was meaningless?" I'd been lying on the couch watching a fish tank in the corner, its one golden prisoner swimming in lazy circles. "Unless you've got a better idea," I said. "Some big theory about what it all means that you haven't told me. Otherwise..." "What?" "Otherwise, this is just a waste of time." He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose as if trying to dispel a headache. "What your grandfather's last words meant isn't my conclusion to draw," he said. "It's what you think that matters." "That is such psychobabble bullshit," I spat. "It's not what I think that matters, it's what's true. But I guess we'll never know, so who cares? Just dope me up and collect the bill." I wanted him to get mad, to argue, to insist that I was wrong. But instead, he sat poker-faced, drumming the arm of his chair with his pen. "It sounds like you're giving up," he said after a moment. "I'm disappointed. You really didn't strike me as a quitter." "Then you don't know me very well," I replied. I could not have been less in the mood for a party. I'd known I'd been in for one the moment my parents began dropping unsubtle hints about how boring and uneventful the upcoming weekend was sure to be, when we all knew perfectly well I was turning 16. I begged them to skip the party this year because, among other reasons, I couldn't think of a single person I wanted to invite. But they worried that I spent too much time alone, clinging to the notion that socializing was therapeutic. So was electroshock, I reminded them. But my mother was loath to pass up even the flimsiest excuse for a celebration. She once invited friends over for our cockatiel's birthday, in part because she loved to show off the house. Wine in hand, she'd heard her guests from room to over-furnished room, extolling the genius of the architect and telling war stories about the construction. It took months to get these scones from Italy. We'd just come home from my disastrous session with Dr. Golan. I was following my dad into our suspiciously dark living room as he muttered things like, "What a shame we didn't plan anything for your birthday," and, "Oh well, there's always next year," when all the lights flooded on to reveal streamers, balloons, and a motley assortment of aunts, uncles, cousins I rarely spoke to, anyone my mother could cajole into attending, and Ricky, whom I was surprised to see lingering near the punch bowl, looking comically out of place in a studded leather jacket. Once everyone had finished cheering, and I had finished pretending to be surprised, my mother slipped her arm around me and whispered, "Is this okay?" I was upset and tired and just wanted to play Warspire 3, The Summoning, before going to bed with the TV on. But what were we going to do, send everyone home? I said it was fine, and she smiled as if to thank me. "Who wants to see the new edition?" she sang out, pouring herself some Chardonnay before marching a troop of relatives up the stairs. Ricky and I nodded to each other from across the room, wordlessly agreeing to tolerate the other's presence for an hour or two. We hadn't spoken since the day he nearly shoved me off the roof, but we both understood the importance of maintaining the illusion of having friends. I was about to go talk to him when my Uncle Bobby grabbed me by my elbow and pulled me into a corner. Bobby was a big, barrel-chested guy who drove a big car and lived in a big house and would eventually succumb to a big heart attack from all the foie gras and monster truck burgers he'd packed into his colon over the years, leaving everything to my pothead cousins and his tiny, quiet wife. He and my Uncle Les were correspondents of Smart Aid, and they were always doing this, pulling people into corners for conspiratorial chats, as if plotting a mob hit rather than complimenting the hostess on her guacamole. "So your mom tells me you're really turning the corner with, on this whole grandpa thing." My thing. No one knew what to call it. "Acute stress reaction," I said. "What?" "That's what I had. Have. Whatever." "That's good. Real good to hear." He waved his hand as if pulling all the unpleasantness behind us. "So your mom and I were thinking, how would you like to come up to Tampa this summer? See how the family business works. Crack heads with me at HQ for a while. Unless you love stocking shelves." He laughed so loudly that I took an involuntary step backward. "You could even stay at my house. Do a little tarpon fishing with me and your cousins on the weekends." He then spent 5 long minutes describing his new yacht, going into elaborate, almost pornographic detail, as if that alone were enough to close the deal. When he finished, he grinned and stuck out his hand for me to shake. "So, what do you think, J-Dog?" I guess it was designed to be an offer I couldn't refuse, but I'd have rather spent the summer in a Siberian labor camp than live with my uncle and his spoiled kids. As for working at Smart Aid HQ, I knew it was probably an inevitable part of my future, but I'd been counting on at least a few more summers of freedom and 4 years of college before I had to lock myself in a corporate cage. I hesitated, trying to think of a graceful way out. Instead, what I said was, "I'm not sure my psychiatrist would think it's such a great idea right now." His bushy eyebrows came together. Nodding vaguely, he said, "Well, sure, of course. We'll just play it by ear then, pal. How's that sound?" And then he walked off without waiting for an answer, pretending to see someone across the room whose elbow he needed to grab. To be continued in Part 3.